Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely breathtaking, chaotic stretch of history. We're unpacking the massive global domino effect from 1870 to 1930 that quite literally built the modern world we live in today. It's a story packed with unimaginable wealth, ruthless ambition, devastating conflict, and radical world-altering change. So, let's get right into it.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 key stops. First, the engine of empire, then the powder keg, the Great War, the system breaks, and we'll wrap things up with a fragile peace.
Starting off with Section 1, the engine of empire, focusing on economics and imperialism.
To really understand the explosions of the early 20th century, we've got to start at the root cause, and that is the aggressive, globe-spanning hunt for wealth. Notice the key word here, surplus. As the English economist John A. Hobson defined it, imperialism wasn't just about politicians wanting to plant flags on new beaches. It was a desperate economic necessity. Think of it like a massive retail chain that has way too much inventory and has completely run out of local customers. They absolutely have to find new neighborhoods to sell in, or the whole thing goes belly up. By the late 19th century, European monopoly capitalists, totally supercharged by the Industrial Revolution, had massive surpluses of manufactured goods and cash. Their domestic markets were just tapped out. They desperately needed new places to park their money and push their products to keep those profits flowing.
Now, this wasn't just some casual expansion, it was a frenzied global scramble. European powers were aggressively rushing to carve up Africa and Asia, and they weren't just looking for buyers either. Mass production requires massive amounts of raw materials, right? We're talking grains, cotton, rubber, crude oil. Industrialists refused to rely on foreign nations for these supplies. They demanded direct control. Plus, they realized they could make an absolute fortune by investing their surplus capital into building railways and roads in these newly acquired lands. This dynamic shifted global power overnight, to the point where practically the entire African continent was partitioned by European powers by the year 1900.
Which brings us to Section 2, the powder keg, looking at alliances and the outbreak of the First World War.
So what exactly happens when the world essentially runs out of new territories to conquer? Well, they inevitably turn their sights on each other. Imperial friction combined with protectionist tariffs, which are basically just high taxes slapped on imported goods to block out competitor nations, forced Europe into 2 rigid, heavily armed camps. On one side, we've got the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, which originally stemmed from Bismarck's earlier efforts to isolate France. And on the flip side, as a direct countermeasure, you have the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. So instead of a fluid, cooperating international community, Europe transformed into this massive, terrifying standoff between 2 heavily armed alliances.
And this perfectly illustrates the domino effect in action. With those rigid alliances locked in, it only took a single spark. On June 28, 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a rapid, totally inescapable chain reaction. Austria struck out at Serbia, Russia mobilized to protect Serbia, Germany jumped in to back up Austria, attacking both Russia and France, and when Germany violated Belgium's neutrality to march on France, well, Britain stepped in and declared war on Germany. In just over a single month, a localized assassination plunged the entire globe into war.
That leads us right into Section 3, the Great War, and the grim reality of the conflict itself. Let's pivot from all that political maneuvering to what was actually happening on the ground. A war completely unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Geographically, Germany and Austria-Hungary, who made up the Central Powers, found themselves completely surrounded. Because of the alliance system, they were immediately trapped in a brutal, resource-draining 2-front war. They had to fight France and Britain in the west, while simultaneously trying to hold off the massive Russian Empire in the east.
The initial German advance, which was hoping to quickly crush France, totally stalled out. This created a horrific stalemate that we now know as trench warfare. The front lines stretched a staggering 650 kilometers, literally from the English Channel all the way down to Switzerland. Soldiers had to burrow deep into the earth, digging zigzag ditch systems just to survive the relentless machine gun fire and artillery shells. It devolved into a pure war of attrition, where millions of young men fought and died for mere yards of muddy earth in absolute meat-grinder battles like the Somme and Verdun.
Meanwhile, a totally different kind of terror was unfolding out at sea. Desperate to break the suffocating naval blockade the Allies had set up, Germany adopted a strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare. They basically used their feared U-boats to sink any ship they could find. And tragically, this strategy included civilian ships, like the British liner the Lusitania, which went down taking 128 American lives with it. This aggressive move eventually shattered American neutrality, pulling the immense industrial and military resources of the United States into the fight on the Allied side.
All right, moving to Section 4, the system breaks, focusing on the Russian Revolution.
Right as America was preparing to enter the fray in 1917, the crushing extreme pressures of the conflict caused one of the oldest European empires to just completely shatter from within. Russia was buckling. Under the oppressive, autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the country was heavily agrarian and really economically backward compared to its European rivals. Plus, their war effort was just an absolute disaster. The Russian people were suffering unbearably. The cities were literally overflowing with starving workers, pushing the entire nation to a highly volatile breaking point.
It's honestly fascinating how fast a centuries-old dynasty can crumble. It began with those long-standing oppressive conditions, right? Compounded by a disastrous war that caused massive food shortages. But the actual tipping point? In February 1917, hungry women textile workers in Petrograd went on strike, marching through the freezing streets for bread. This localized strike quickly spiraled into mass demonstrations. When the Tsar ordered the military to crush the protests, the soldiers actually mutinied instead. Within a week, just a single week, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. After a brief, struggling provisional government, we see a total Bolshevik takeover by October.
And stepping right into that immense power vacuum was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He seized control with a brilliantly simple yet incredibly effective promise to the desperate Russian people: bread, peace, and land. It's catchy, right? By March 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, completely yanking Soviet Russia out of the World War and fundamentally altering global politics forever by establishing the world's very first communist state.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, a fragile peace, covering Versailles and the League of Nations.
With Russia out of the picture, but the incredibly powerful United States now in, the tide of the war decisively turned. By late 1918, a deserted, totally exhausted Germany finally surrendered, which brings us to the final, highly controversial chapter of our domino effect. The victorious powers all gathered in Paris in 1919 to rebuild the world. But as we'll quickly see, this room was absolutely packed with leaders who had radically different and heavily competing visions for what the future should actually look like.
When you compare the ideals to the reality, it's wild to see how drastically the final treaty deviated from American President Woodrow Wilson's initial optimistic hopes. Wilson proposed his famous 14 points, aiming for impartial colonial settlements, removing economic barriers, and global disarmament. Sounds great, right? Well, the actual Treaty of Versailles was deeply, deeply punitive. It stripped Germany of crucial land and all its overseas colonies, dismantled its military down to a mere 100,000 men, and slapped the nation with a crushing $33 billion in war reparations. It completely threw the ideals of a fair peace out the window in favor of aggressively punishing the losers.
Now, Wilson did manage to get one major ideal over the finish line: the creation of a League of Nations, designed to prevent future wars through collective security. But despite this victory on paper, the League's fatal flaws were glaringly obvious from day one. For starters, it was viewed as an exclusive club for the war's victors. It had absolutely zero military teeth to enforce any of its rulings. Plus, it required unanimous votes for political decisions, basically paralyzing its ability to act. But the final nail in the coffin? The devastating absence of major world powers, most notably the United States, whose own Senate flat-out refused to join Wilson's brainchild. This left the newly drawn global order incredibly fragile and vulnerable.
Which leaves us with a really crucial question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Looking at all the dominoes we've tracked today, from the frantic scramble for empire to the rigid military alliances, the absolute horrors of trench warfare, the total collapse of Russia, and finally a highly vindictive peace settlement, we have to ask, was the Treaty of Versailles actually a solution that ended the conflict, or did it simply press pause, setting an incredibly dangerous trap that would spring-shot the very moment the Great Depression pushed the world's economy over the edge once again? Think on that as you consider how the echoes of these empires still shape the modern world we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the past.